Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin with Story 1, the division that changed everything, Diocletian and the birth of the East. You are living in the late 3rd century CE. The Roman Empire is bloated, fraying, and in constant turmoil. If you're a merchant, your routes are unsafe. If you're a farmer, your taxes feel eternal. If you're a soldier, your allegiance shifts with the next general. And if you're the emperor, your job is a death sentence. In the year 284 CE, a man named Diocles, the son of a freed slave from the Roman province of Dalmatia, is declared emperor by his troops. You might not have cared much emperors come and go. After all, but Diocles would soon rename himself Diocletian, and without a single battle more dramatic than a bureaucratic decision, he would split the Roman Empire in a way no one had dared before. This wasn't a rupture, it was a plan. But let's not begin with the grand pronouncements of division. Let's begin with paperwork. The unraveling before the reform. For over a century, the Roman Empire had been teetering. There had been over 26 emperors in 50 years, most meeting violent ends. Inflation soared, borders crumbled, and plague left swaths of territory empty. By the time Diocletian took control, administration was failing because no one could possibly manage a territory stretching from Britain to Syria. The old republican ideals were long dead. The Senate was a ceremonial relic. Provinces were loosely monitored, and local governors were often corrupt, disconnected, or simply confused about who was actually in charge. Diocletian, though, had something unusual for a Roman emperor, a deeply administrative mind. He didn't want glory. He wanted stability, and he knew that required not heroism but process. The quiet creation of the Tetrarchy. In 293 CE, nearly a decade into his rule, Diocletian made a decision that, in retrospect, was quietly revolutionary. He formalized a 4-part imperial structure now known as the Tetrarchy Rule of 4. Diocletian would remain the Augustus of the East. His trusted colleague Maximian would rule the West. Each would have a junior emperor, a Caesar, who could take over if necessary. These were Galerius in the east and Constantius Chlorus in the west. To the average Roman citizen, this might have seemed unremarkable at first, but it was deeply radical. The empire was now being run like a business, with regional managers and a succession plan. No more scramble for power, no more civil wars over succession, in theory at least. But the shift was not just political, it was administrative, visual, and even architectural. Dividing the undividable. Diocletian redrew the empire's administrative map. Provinces were split into smaller units. Regional capitals were created. Nicomedia, for example, in modern-day Turkey, became the de facto capital of the East. Not Rome, not even Constantinople, which didn't yet exist. This new structure gave rise to dioceses, administrative clusters that would outlive the empire itself, and form the basis for both ecclesiastical and civil governance in medieval Europe. Taxes were now recorded in astonishing detail. Censuses became regular again. Edicts were issued to control prices. The empire's economy was increasingly planned, its military divided into mobile units and static defenders. And the split between East and West, while not absolute, began to take shape in both function and identity. Still, this was not called the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't even Eastern Rome. It was all still Rome, just Rome, managed more practically. Daily life in a divided empire. If you lived in the East, say, in Antioch or Alexandria, you might not have even noticed much at first. Local officials remained the same. Greek remained the dominant language. Trade continued, if more heavily taxed. But subtle shifts began. Temples lost funding. Tax collection became stricter. Military recruiters were more present in your town. Officials now reported to Nicomedia, not Rome, and the regional differences in language, in economy, in culture grew. To the east, Latin became more distant. To the west, the wealth of the East, its spices, textiles, learned scholars seemed increasingly foreign. And yet the division, still unofficial, was mostly in mindset and management. The boring machinery of stability. Behind Diocletian's visible changes was a web of dull but essential machinery. Military districts were separated from civilian ones. Governors had fewer opportunities for abuse. Local bureaucrats were more accountable. Tax systems, while often oppressive, were more regularized. He even introduced uniform taxation in kind, meaning you might pay your taxes in wheat or cattle instead of coins. This helped address inflation, though for you. It might simply mean having fewer options to feed your family. In 301 CE, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to curb inflation. It failed, but it revealed something. Diocletian believed the emperor had a responsibility to regulate, not just rule. This was a managerial, not charismatic reign. He was building structures, not monuments. A system, not a savior. Perhaps most tellingly, in 305 CE, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated, the first Roman emperor to do so. He retired to his palace in Split, modern-day Croatia, where he famously tended to his gardens. When asked to return later during a crisis, he reportedly said, "If you could see the cabbages I have grown with my own hands, you wouldn't ask me to take up the burden of government again." And that was perhaps his most profound legacy. He didn't want to be remembered as a conqueror, but as an organizer. He left a system, one that, though imperfect, allowed the Eastern Roman Empire to survive for 1,000 more years. And yet, despite the reforms, the tetrarchy would collapse. Succession would again breed violence. The division of East and West would become permanent, and Diocletian's vision, so precise, would give way to the chaos of ambition. But still, the structures he built, the divisions he planned, the cities he chose would shape the Byzantine world to come. Would the East have survived without these reforms, or were they simply a brief pause before the inevitable? The world Diocletian left behind in 305 CE was highly structured, rationalized, and as balanced as any empire of its size could be. But balance in Rome never lasted. You may have been a farmer in Syria or a shopkeeper in Gaul. You may not have known names like Galerius or Constantius Chlorus, but within a decade you would come to know one name above all others: Constantine. If Diocletian was the builder of bureaucracy, Constantine was its rewriter. The East would no longer be just the well-managed half of a strained empire. Under Constantine, it would become the spiritual and administrative heart of a transformed world. But before the vision, there was chaos. The collapse of the tetrarchy. The carefully designed tetrarchic system lasted barely a breath after Diocletian's retirement. Human nature, that unscripted variable, reasserted itself. Galerius and Constantius ruled as the senior Augusti, but ambition among their juniors and sons tore the system apart. Constantius died in 306 CE while campaigning in Britain. His son, Constantine, was declared emperor by his father's troops in York, a break with the succession rules. At the same time, Maxentius, son of Maximian, claimed power in Italy. Other usurpers followed. Within 6 years, no fewer than 6 men claimed the imperial title. The empire teetered toward civil war. The very thing Diocletian had tried to avoid, the inheritance of power through bloodlines, had returned, and with it, the The collapse of shared rule. Constantine's rise through war and symbols. Constantine's journey from Britain to dominance was not linear. It was filled with negotiation, betrayal, and relentless campaigning. But it was at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, a skirmish just outside Rome, that Constantine's future changed, and perhaps the future of the East as well. According to later chroniclers, Constantine saw a vision, a Cairo symbol, an early Christian emblem, accompanied by the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign you will conquer." He had his soldiers paint the symbol on their shields. That night, belief and politics began to intertwine in ways unseen since the pagan rites of imperial cults. And when Constantine won, decisively, the Christianization of imperial power began not with theological arguments, but on a blood-stained bridge. The Edict of Milan, and a new imperial logic. In 313 CE, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity and guaranteed freedom of worship. This was not yet a Christian empire. Paganism remained dominant. The edict did not impose belief, it simply allowed it. But it shifted imperial favor toward the Christian communities that had long lived on the margins, especially in the East. By 324 CE, Constantine had defeated Licinius and become sole ruler of the empire. His attention turned more fully eastward. The old Rome, with its Senate, its pagan temples, and its conservative nobility, seemed increasingly out of sync with his vision. He wanted a new Rome, one shaped in his image and in the image of an empire reborn. The choice of Byzantium. In 324 CE, Constantine selected an unremarkable Greek city, Byzantium, to become his capital. Not Alexandria, not Antioch, not Athens. Byzantium. Why? The reasons were not mystical but pragmatic, boring, even. Byzantium sat at a strategic junction between Europe and Asia. It was defensible, surrounded on three sides by water. It controlled important trade routes, and crucially, it was underdeveloped, a blank canvas. In 330 CE, he officially inaugurated the city as Nova Roma, or New Rome. But everyone soon called it Constantinople. And just like that, the Byzantine Empire had its symbolic heart, though no one called it Byzantine yet. A new imperial culture. Constantine's Constantinople was more than a political project. It was a cultural and religious experiment. While he did not ban paganism, many temples remained open. He heavily sponsored Christian churches. The city became a hub for bishops, theologians, and administrators alike. The eastern provinces, long Greek-speaking and culturally distinct from the Latin West, found in Constantinople a capital that reflected their identity. In urban design, too, the East diverged. Constantine modeled his city partly on Rome but added wide forums, vast Christian basilicas, and infrastructure suited to defense and maritime commerce. He laid down a civic vision, one shaped not by conquest but by stability, a legacy of Diocletian's administrative logic, now fused with spiritual authority. Christianity and control. While Christianity was legalized, Constantine sought unity more than purity. Doctrinal disputes were already threatening to split the church. In 325 CE, he called the Council of Nicaea not out of theological passion, but administrative necessity. Disagreement over whether Christ was co-eternal with God the Father, as argued by Athanasius, or a created being, as argued by Arius, was causing deep schisms. Constantine wanted unity. The council denounced Arianism, though the debate would simmer for centuries. This episode highlights Constantine's approach. He saw religion as an instrument of order, a social glue, not merely a spiritual path. The rise of Eastern identity. In Constantine's time, the East still considered itself fully Roman. Latin remained the language of officialdom. The Senate still existed, but in daily life you would have heard Greek in the markets, seen Eastern art and architecture, and encountered local customs rooted in older Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions. While the West became increasingly rural and unstable, the East urbanized. Cities like Antioch, Ephesus, and Caesarea flourished. The infrastructure built by Diocletian roads, ports, tax districts enabled commerce to thrive, even as military challenges loomed. The East began to feel not just like a half of the empire, but its center of gravity. The death of Constantine, the birth of a future. In 337 CE, Constantine died. He had been baptized shortly before death, as was common in that era. He left behind a divided empire among his sons, leading to more wars but also leaving Constantinople fully formed, a spiritual and administrative capital ready to outlast its maker. The city was now a living metaphor, rooted in Roman tradition, governed with Eastern pragmatism, and infused with Christian symbolism. The Byzantine Empire, as we would later call it, had all the components in place even if it didn't yet know its name. But questions remained. Was Constantine's embrace of Christianity sincere or strategic? Did his vision of unity sow the seeds for centuries of theological conflict? And was the foundation of Constantinople a sign of imperial renewal or of the final abandonment of the Roman West? You're living in the aftermath of Constantine's rule. It's the mid-4th century now. The Roman Empire still exists on parchment and maps east and west, two halves of a whole, but reality is messier. Borders shift, armies march, emperors rise and fall. Through it all, the East quietly begins to stand on its own, not in rebellion but in resilience. This is not yet the Byzantine Empire, but its skeleton is forming in city walls, tax ledgers, and church sermons. The slow, bureaucratic, and often tedious transformation of Eastern Rome into Byzantium is not marked by a single event, but by centuries of subtle change. If you blink, you might miss it. The fracture becomes permanent. After Constantine's death in 337 CE, the empire was divided among his sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. What followed was a pattern familiar to any Roman official: infighting, assassination, and consolidation. By 353 CE, only Constantius II remained. He ruled from Constantinople. Rome, once the heartbeat of empire, was increasingly a ceremonial city. The real work of governance, tax collection, military command, theological dispute happened in the East. By the time of Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395 CE, the fracture had become formal. In 395 CE, after Theodosius died, the empire was permanently divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. They never ruled jointly again. The Eastern advantage. What gave the East its staying power? It wasn't just fortune, though geography helped. The Eastern Roman Empire had major population centers. Cities like Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria were wealthy, well-defended, and deeply rooted in trade and tradition. Economic stability. The East was wealthier, with more taxable land and robust trade routes to Asia. Administrative continuity. Diocletian's reforms, Constantine's structures, they were preserved, not discarded. Cultural coherence. Greek language and Hellenistic traditions helped unify the region more than the Latin West could manage. Meanwhile, the West was crumbling. Rome was sacked in 410 CE by the Visigoths, again in 455 by the Vandals. The Western Roman Empire officially fell in 476 CE when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. And yet in Constantinople, banners still flew, coins were minted, edicts were issued. The Eastern emperors continued, uninterrupted, referring to themselves simply as Romans. The unseen machinery of continuity. You might wonder how the East managed to function while its counterpart fell apart? The answer lies in the dull details of governance. The Notitia Dignitatum, a bureaucratic document compiled around 400 CE, outlined civil and military offices across the empire. It showed just how complex and duplicated the imperial machinery had become. The Praetorian prefectures Diocletian's legacy survived, evolving into regional power structures with their own logic and traditions. Tax systems remained burdensome but consistent. The East could still collect the annona, the grain tax that funded the military and urban welfare. The senatorial class in the East adapted. Rather than resisting change, many embraced Christian roles, became church patrons, or joined the imperial court. None of this was glamorous, but this slow administrative ossification helped the East outlive the West. The rise of church and state as one. Perhaps the most distinct feature of the Eastern Empire's evolution was its fusion of imperial and ecclesiastical power. Starting with Constantine, emperors began playing an active role in church affairs. By the time of Theodosius I, Christianity was not just legal, it was state-enforced. In 380 CE, the Edict of Thessalonica declared Nicene Christianity the only legal faith of the empire. Pagan temples were shuttered, heresies were condemned. Bishops and emperors often worked in tandem, sometimes in tension. In Constantinople, the patriarch became almost as powerful as the emperor himself, at least in matters of theology. Church councils became imperial policy debates. Doctrine was not just a spiritual matter, it was an issue of civil harmony. The East became a place where faith shaped law, and law preserved faith. The city of Constantine. Life in Constantinople, now decades after its founding, was strikingly Roman in form but distinct in character. The Forum of Constantine, modeled on Roman spaces, was lined with statues of emperors and gods. The Hippodrome hosted chariot races, riots, and imperial announcements. Aqueducts and cisterns sustained the city's population. The beginnings of the great palace complex reflected a growing emphasis on ceremonial authority. You might have lived in a tenement block above a busy street, attended liturgy at the Church of the Holy Apostles, or worked at a harbor counting sacks of Egyptian grain. And over it all loomed a new sense of identity, still Roman, yes, but increasingly Eastern, Christian, and imperial in a different key. A different kind of empire. By the early 6th century, under Emperor Justinian I, the Eastern Roman Empire would embark on efforts to reclaim the West, to codify Roman law, and to construct monumental churches like the Hagia Sophia. But even then, no one called it Byzantine. To its own people, it was still the Roman Empire, just as it had always been. Yet the language was now Greek. The art was distinct. The theology was specific. The bureaucracy was inherited but transformed. It was a new civilization, hiding in the clothes of an old one. Legacy and reflection. When we speak of the Byzantine Empire, we often picture the grandeur of Justinian, the chaos of iconoclasm, or the tragedy of 1453. But the foundation of it all lies in bureaucratic drift, urban development, and quiet decisions made by emperors like Diocletian and Constantine. It was not a revolution, but a reorganization. Not a break, but a reorientation. From one perspective, the Byzantine Empire was simply Rome's eastern half surviving longer. But from another, it was something altogether different, a fusion of Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian belief that endured for 1,000 years. But what if? What if Diocletian had not divided the empire? What if Constantine had chosen a different capital or no new capital at all? Would Rome have endured longer, or would the East have fallen with it? And can an empire truly know when it becomes something else, or does that recognition only come after it's gone? Story 2. Invisible infrastructure. roads, aqueducts, and the logistics of empire. If you were walking through Antioch in the 4th century, or waiting for a shipment in Ephesus, or farming in the Thracian interior, you probably didn't think about the road beneath your feet or the canal that carried water to your fields. These things were simply their part of life. But behind that normal was a web of planning, labor, and maintenance that was absolutely essential. Invisible infrastructure was what kept the Eastern Roman Empire functional. The roads, aqueducts, postal relays, way stations, and rural grain depots that made imperial control possible. These were not the glamorous triumphal arches or ceremonial forums. They were gravel paths, stone bridges, and mud-slick canals. And yet, without them, the Byzantine world would never have risen. From military roads to lifelines. The Roman road network had originally been designed for one thing: military movement. As early as the 3rd century BCE, roads were built straight and wide to accommodate legions, ox-drawn carts, and marching formations. But by the time of the Eastern Empire, the purpose had expanded. The roads were now conduits for tax collection, carrying records money, and sometimes the tax goods themselves, like grain or sheep. Commerce, merchants transporting goods from Egypt to Syria, from the Black Sea to Constantinople. Pilgrimage, growing numbers of Christians traveling to shrines, churches, or monasteries. Administration, imperial messengers, governors, and inspectors moving between regions. Some roads were paved with stone. Others, especially in mountainous terrain, were simple dirt tracks. But even the most minor roads were cataloged and monitored, part of a system known as the cursus publicus. The cursus publicus, Rome's state delivery system. This state-run courier system was the logistical backbone of imperial administration. It had existed in the early empire, but was refined in the East. If you were an imperial messenger, you'd carry a diploma, a wax tablet, or metal pass, allowing you access to relay stations, mutations, every 10-20 miles where you could change horses. Rest stations, mansions, where food and lodging were provided. Official stables, maintained by local communities and requisitioned as needed. The cursus publicus was not available to everyone. It was restricted and strictly regulated. Abuse of its services was punishable, at least in theory, but it meant that a message from Constantinople could reach the Syrian frontier in under 2 weeks. That was speed for the ancient world. The builders behind the roads. None of this infrastructure maintained itself. Roads and bridges were built by military engineers, but more often by corvée labor peasants conscripted for unpaid seasonal work. Cities were responsible for local upkeep, often underfunded and resentful. Inspectors called curators viarum were appointed to ensure repairs. They submitted written reports, filed expense claims, and coordinated with provincial governors. Many were retired soldiers, chosen for their discipline rather than architectural knowledge. Sometimes roads were repaired with broken statues, melted marble, or old building blocks. The goal was function, not beauty. In rural areas, these roads might be impassable in spring, cracked in summer, and flooded in winter. Still, caravans moved. The empire continued. Aqueducts, gravity and empire. While roads moved people and goods, aqueducts moved life. Constantinople, though rich in rainfall, was heavily reliant on long-distance water supply systems. The most famous was the Valens Aqueduct, begun in the 4th century and expanded over time. It ran for over 250 kilometers further than any aqueduct in the Western Empire. If you stood on a hill outside Constantinople, you might see a ribbon of stone arcades marching across the countryside. But much of the aqueduct was underground: tunnels, clay pipes, and gravity-fed conduits. The engineering was precise. A decline of even 0.01% could carry water for miles without pumps. Filters were built along the way. Settling tanks cleared out sediment. Cisterns like the Basilica cistern beneath Constantinople stored the precious supply. Water supported more than drinking and bathing. It allowed urban sanitation, running toilets, fountains, and sewage systems. Textile manufacturing, fulling mills and dye vats. Military provisioning, barracks needed steady water supplies. When aqueducts failed due to earthquake, neglect, or invasion, cities withered. Grain, granaries, and quiet logistics. Imagine you are a grain merchant in Alexandria. Your crop is weighed, taxed in kind, and loaded onto ships bound for the capital. This was part of the annona system, a tax in grain, used to supply Constantinople and the army. In the West, this system had decayed. In the East, it remained remarkably effective. Grain was stored in horia, large, stone-walled granaries. These were temperature-regulated, ventilated, and guarded. Some stood along riverbanks. Others were in inland depots near military roads. From Egypt to Thrace, a chain of supplies stretched. Harvested grain, transported by ox cart or barge, stored in regional granaries, moved in bulk to Constantinople via sea or land, distributed to bakers, army units, or sold at state-regulated markets. This was not a free market. Prices were regulated. Distribution was supervised. Even bread weights were measured. It was bureaucracy, not capitalism, and it kept cities fed. Warehouses, harbors, and hidden networks. Constantinople's port of Theodosius was the largest harbor in the empire. Goods arrived daily: silk from Syria, oil from Palestine, wine from the Aegean, furs from the Caucasus. Beneath the city, vast warehouses stored these imports. Inventories were managed by officials, logged with styluses, and tracked on wax tablets. The empire relied not just on trade, but on inventory control. What seems modern resource tracking, logistics flow, supply chain monitoring, was in many ways anticipated by Roman and Byzantine administrators. They understood that power was not just about military victory, but about being able to feed, move, and shelter a population. The fact that these systems were boring, slow, and bureaucratic was their strength. Infrastructure and identity. To live in the Eastern Roman Empire was to live in a space where imperial control was made real by infrastructure. You might never see the emperor, but you walked on a road built by his engineers. You drank water from an aqueduct funded by his treasury. You received grain whose distribution he regulated. You posted a letter that traveled via his cursus publicus. This created loyalty not through spectacle, but through service. Even during invasions or plagues, infrastructure often endured longer than political stability. And when Constantinople was under siege, it was cisterns, walls, and grain depots that saved the city. But still, one must ask, how much of an empire can remain when its roads fall silent, when its aqueducts dry up, when no one bothers to repair the bridge or clean the cistern? Was the strength of Byzantium in its emperors or in its engineers? By now you understand that the Eastern Roman Empire didn't run on charisma or military alone. It ran on stone, dust, and sweat. It ran on the labor of thousands who would never meet an emperor, never receive a title, and never have their names recorded. From the stonemason chiseling an aqueduct block to the ox driver hauling grain through Anatolian mud, these forgotten individuals were the true lifeblood of the empire's infrastructure. This section dives deeper into the labor force, maintenance practices, and unspoken economy of the Eastern Empire's logistical system, the dirty, unpaid, and absolutely necessary work that kept the empire functioning. Who built the empire, not the emperors? You often hear about emperors commissioning great works: aqueducts, roads, granaries, but what did that really mean? It meant compelling labor. The imperial state did not operate on wage labor alone. It depended heavily on two main sources: corvée labor mandatory, unpaid labor levied by the state, typically from rural populations; military engineers, particularly the limitane, or frontier troops, who often did construction in peacetime. Corvée labor was not voluntary. If you were a farmer in Bithynia, you might be called for 90 days a year to build roads, dig ditches, or haul stone for aqueduct repairs. This was considered part of your tax obligation. There were few tools, no machines, and little comfort. You brought your own food. Injuries were common. Recognition was rare. But without these anonymous builders, the aqueducts would crumble, roads would wash away, and the post stations would collapse into fields of grass. Guilds and specialists, the skilled among the anonymous. In the cities, however, a different kind of laborer emerged: craftsmen and guild workers. In Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, collegia guilds controlled specific trades. Aquarii, water carriers and aqueduct maintainers. Pavimentarii, road pavers and foundation specialists. Calcators, those who crushed lime for mortar. Navicularii, ship owners responsible for grain transport. These guilds were state-regulated. Membership was hereditary. You could not leave the guild, even if the work declined. In this way, the empire ensured that someone was always responsible for essential services. Guilds were not glamorous. They were obligatory, sometimes even punitive, a lifelong civic duty passed from father to son. But they ensured a chain of skilled labor that kept the Byzantine economy from collapsing under its own weight. Repair culture, maintenance as a form of empire. In modern times, we speak of repair as secondary to construction. But in the Eastern Roman Empire, maintenance was power. Provinces were expected to report regularly on infrastructure conditions. This included roads and bridges, harbor piers, aqueduct channels and cisterns, granary stockpiles, public baths and drainage systems. Provincial governors compiled these reports and submitted them to the central authorities, often in triplicate, using wax tablets or papyrus scrolls. Neglect wasn't just a nuisance, it was a sign of weakness. A neglected aqueduct meant a population could not be bathed, fed, or taxed efficiently. And sometimes, neglected infrastructure meant rebellion. Inconvenient geography, ingenious solutions. The Eastern Empire was not flat. It was mountainous, arid in parts, and crisscrossed by rivers. Moving water across Anatolia or stone through Syria required engineering workarounds that were less Roman idealism and more hard-earned pragmatism. Bridges were built with local stone, often using arched Roman designs but adapted for terrain. Cuttings were made through hillsides, manual labor with chisels and picks, sometimes over years. Tunnels for water involved dangerous, claustrophobic digging with little light. Terraced roads wound carefully through unstable slopes, reinforced with low retaining walls. The engineers and workers weren't building to impress. They were building for function and often survival. Water shortages and local solutions. When an aqueduct broke or dried up, cities had to improvise. Sometimes, this meant relying on cisterns and wells, hundreds of them beneath Constantinople alone. In rural areas, villages pooled money or labor to dig qanats, sloped underground channels that slowly fed water from higher elevations. These were inspired by Persian technology and adopted by Eastern Roman engineers. Water thieves were common, farmers illegally diverting state aqueducts to irrigate private fields. Punishment could range from fines to imprisonment, but enforcement was uneven, and local officials often looked the other way, especially during drought. The economy of movement. In addition to builders, the Byzantine logistical network required movers. Beast handlers, mulari, who managed oxen, donkeys, and camels. cartwrights who maintained wheels and axles, harbor loaders who transferred cargo by hand from ship to quay, stable masters at posting stations, responsible for maintaining horses and mules. This entire labor ecosystem operated under a non-cash economy. Payment might be in kind grain, wine, cloth, in tax exemptions, in deferred privileges like access to land or tools. Money did circulate, especially in cities, but outside Constantinople, service and obligation were still the main currency. Imperial inspectors and their paper trails. To manage all this, the empire employed logothetes, mid-level bureaucrats who traveled, inspected, and reported. A logothetes 2 dramu might inspect postal stations. A logothetes 2 geniku would audit grain taxes. They carried small chests with seals and stamps, ink and pens, account tablets, edicts and blank reports. These officials were dreaded in rural provinces. A single poor inspection could lead to extra taxation, reassignment of labor, or public fines. Yet their work created some of the most accurate administrative records in the pre-modern world. The fragility beneath the efficiency. Despite the remarkable resilience of the Eastern Roman infrastructure, it remained fragile. An earthquake could sever an aqueduct, a flood could wash away a road, a rebellious governor could block grain shipments. And when maintenance faltered due to war, neglect, or funding shortages, the effects were immediate. Food shortages, disease outbreaks, market disruption, political unrest. In this way, logistics was not a neutral part of governance. It was a daily negotiation with nature, rebellion, and time. But consider this. How did a society that depended so heavily on manual labor, mandatory service, and unpaid work manage to sustain itself for centuries? And what happened when the workers silent, nameless, invisible stopped showing up? By the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had survived famine, civil war, and the collapse of its Western counterpart. Constantinople thrived, roads still carried troops, and aqueducts still delivered water. But beneath this resilience, the empire's infrastructure had begun a slow, subtle decline, not with fire or invasion, but with neglect, overuse, and shifting priorities. It is easy to imagine an empire falling through war. Harder to see when it unravels through the failure to fix a cracked pipe or repair a flooded bridge. This final section explores how Byzantium's greatest strength, its infrastructure, slowly became its greatest vulnerability. The Justinianic surge and strain. The reign of Justinian I, 527–565 CE, is often seen as the high point of Byzantine ambition. Roads were rebuilt, fortifications expanded, aqueducts repaired and extended. The Great Hagia Sophia was constructed after the Nika riots in 532, a marvel of architecture and logistics. But Justinian's efforts were not free. To fund them, he heavily taxed cities and provinces. The bureaucratic machinery swelled. Provincial governors were pushed to extract more from local populations, especially in the east, the breadbasket of the empire. Peasants were conscripted more frequently. Guilds were frozen in place. Even the cursus publicus, the once great postal and transport system, began to feel the strain. Horses died faster than they were replaced. Roads were patched, not repaved. The infrastructure held barely, but the cracks were beginning to show. The plague and its ripples. In 541 CE, the plague of Justinian struck Constantinople. Within weeks, tens of thousands were dead. Over the following year, it spread throughout the Eastern Empire. The loss of life was catastrophic, not just for the urban elite, but for the very people who made infrastructure work. Road crews and repair laborers, granary keepers, shipbuilders and sailors, aqueduct supervisors. The census system broke down. Tax records vanished with the dead. Planned repairs were delayed. Cities once supported by aqueducts and grain networks found themselves isolated. And yet the bureaucracy continued issuing reports. Edicts were copied. Inspectors filed travel logs. The machine ran, but now on fewer gears. When nature doesn't wait. The Eastern Roman Empire was always vulnerable to nature. Earthquakes were common, especially in Asia Minor. Floods disrupted rivers and aqueduct routes. Even coastal erosion ate away at crucial harbor piers and warehouses. Without constant maintenance, these systems degraded rapidly. A cracked aqueduct might contaminate drinking water. A broken bridge could isolate a military garrison. A silted harbor could block grain shipments from Egypt. And during times of political or religious unrest like the iconoclast controversy in the 8th century, these issues were often ignored or deliberately underfunded. Iconoclast emperors often redirected funds from infrastructure to religious enforcement. The roads, canals, and cisterns didn't revolt, but they were abandoned. From empire to archipelago. By the 9th century, the Byzantine world began to look less like a centralized empire and more like a network of regional hubs, loosely connected. Constantinople remained a jewel thanks to the imperial focus and protective walls. But rural provinces, especially in Anatolia and the Levant, saw declining infrastructure investment. Roads disappeared beneath overgrowth. Aqueducts were looted for stone. The cursus publicus became a shadow of its former self, increasingly privatized or informally used by clergy and merchants. Instead of an empire tied together by stone and system, Byzantium became a mosaic urban centers surrounded by a patchwork of decaying support. Private solutions for public problems. As state infrastructure faltered, the wealthy stepped in. Elite families built private cisterns, walled compounds with their own wells, and hired guards to patrol damaged roads near their estates. Monasteries became crucial logistical nodes managing food supplies, running guest houses, and repairing roads in their domains. Charity filled the gap where state support failed. But this created inequality. While monks and nobles navigated collapsing roads with their own caravans and maps, peasants became isolated. Local markets dried up. Grain surpluses rotted before reaching distant buyers. The empire no longer functioned as a single organism. It became a collection of survivors. The military burdened on infrastructure. With constant threats from Persians, Slavs, Bulgars, and eventually Arabs, the empire leaned heavily on fortified cities and mobile forces. This had logistical consequences. Roads leading to fortresses were maintained, others abandoned. Aqueducts were routed around areas prone to raids. Granaries were moved closer to military zones, far from traditional urban centers. Infrastructure was no longer designed for civilian use, but for strategic survival. And while that kept the empire alive, it meant that the everyday systems of life, sanitation, commerce, pilgrimage deteriorated in peacetime functions. The legacy of ruins. By the time of the 11th century, Byzantine travelers could walk along ancient Roman roads still visible, still technically intact, but choked with weeds and unmarked. The Valens aqueduct continued to function into the Ottoman period, though barely maintained by imperial engineers after the 10th century. The cursus publicus, once a marvel of imperial reach, was reduced to private messengers and monastic riders. Grain transport, once a feat of regulation and scale, became increasingly local, with Constantinople relying more on Thrace and the Aegean than Egypt. The systems that once defined the Eastern Roman Empire faded not in drama, but in disuse. A reflection on decline. This was not a spectacular collapse. It was not the sacking of Rome. It was the decay of logistics. The slow wearing down of wheels on unmended roads. the crumbling mortar and bridges no one inspected, the records of tax and grain lost in mildew-stained scrolls. In the end, the fall of infrastructure did not cause the fall of Byzantium, but it meant that when political and military crises came, the empire was brittle, less able to move troops, feed cities, or adapt quickly. 1,000 years of bureaucracy could not substitute for a repaired bridge. And yet one wonders, could Byzantium have survived longer if it had maintained its infrastructure more faithfully? Or was decline inevitable in a world where roads outlived the very maps that named them? And when future empires rise, will their fall be marked not by fire or invasion, but by the quiet failure of the things we no longer see? Story 3. The Not-So-Holy Bureaucracy, How Church and State Became the Same Thing. You're a clerk in Constantinople in the 5th century CE. You work in a low-lit office near the Chalk Gate, shuffling through petitions and imperial rescripts. Your pen scratches parchment. The smell of beeswax and damp vellum hangs in the air. Outside, bells toll from the nearby Hagia Irene. Inside, you're copying a law about church land ownership. This is no longer the Rome of temples and togas. It is a city and an empire where religious doctrine and state policy are intertwined so deeply that even clerks like you must understand theology. Because now, the church is not just part of the empire, it is part of the government. The quiet fusion begins. Though Constantine had legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, the real turning point came a generation later. In 380 CE, under Theodosius I, the empire issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Nicene Christianity the state religion. From this point forward, Christianity wasn't just tolerated, it was enforced. Heresies were outlawed, pagan temples closed, bishops gained legal authority. The state didn't just support religion, it managed it. The bureaucratic world began to change. Edicts about canon law, church discipline, and doctrinal disputes began appearing alongside those about taxes and military levies. The imperial chancellery added specialists trained in both law and theology. Religious decisions required imperial approval, and state decisions often relied on ecclesiastical consent. In a sense, Rome didn't fall, it was baptized. The emperor as theologian-in-chief. In classical Rome, the emperor was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the pagan pantheon. This title faded under Christian rule, but the spirit of imperial religious authority remained. By the 5th century, the emperor was expected to convene church councils, enforce orthodoxy, punish heresy, fund cathedral construction. He was not a bishop, but he behaved as one. The emperor's role was not passive. He was the final court of appeal for theological disputes and often initiated them. Emperors issued religious edicts with bureaucratic precision. The Codex Theodosianus, a law code compiled in the 430s, included hundreds of laws about church governance, doctrine, liturgy, and heresy, from the ownership of basilicas to the suppression of Donatists and Arians. This was not a spiritual transformation, it was an administrative one. Bishops with badges. As the empire Christianized, bishops gained power, not just in churches but in courts, councils, and cities. They were judicial authorities, hearing cases involving widows, orphans, and clerics. Land administrators, overseeing vast church estates. Civic organizers, leading charity efforts, managing grain supplies, funding infrastructure. Some bishops, like Ambrose of Milan, directly challenged imperial authority and won. When Theodosius ordered a massacre in Thessalonica, Ambrose publicly refused to allow him entry into the church until he repented. This was the strange new world of Byzantium, where a bishop might excommunicate an emperor, and the emperor might fire a bishop. And both would file paperwork afterward. Church property and imperial revenue. By the 5th century, the church had become one of the largest landowners in the empire. With land came revenue, and with revenue came bureaucratic entanglement. Church lands were technically tax-exempt, but this led to conflict. Imperial agents tried to assess church land value anyway. Bishops lobbied for wider exemptions. Local governors, under fiscal pressure, skirted the rules. Churchmen issued petitions and appeals to Constantinople. The result, a paper war. Dozens of edicts tried to clarify what church land was exempt, who could be taxed, and when bishops could be fined. The line between temple and treasury blurred. Clerics in court and in code. Another shift happened beneath the surface. Clerics began joining the bureaucracy itself. Many educated men in the 5th and 6th centuries entered church service not for monastic isolation, but for imperial access. Bishops became court advisors. Deacons ran archives. Monks were hired as scribes. In some cases, imperial officials themselves became bishops, with careers that moved fluidly between chancelleries and cathedrals. This overlap produced a hybrid class, the clerical bureaucrat who knew how to quote both Cicero and Chrysostom, how to write a legal formula and a liturgical prayer. It also meant that imperial law and Christian ethics were written into the same texts. Councils as policy summits. Church councils were no longer mere theological gatherings. They became imperial events, akin to modern-day summits, where state policy was forged through religious consensus. The Council of Ephesus, 431, and Council of Chalcedon, 451, for example, were held under imperial oversight, enforced by troops, recorded by scribes, and preserved in imperial archives. Disagreements over Christ's nature, was he fully divine, fully human, both, led to schisms, exile, and military unrest. But these councils also produced legal documents, civil ordinances, and administrative changes. In Byzantium, to disagree theologically was to risk treason. Charity, urban control, and the quiet power of the church. As infrastructure aged and state funds dwindled, the church took over many public functions. Feeding the poor, housing the sick, educating children, managing orphanages and hospices. These weren't just acts of piety, they were forms of civic control. The Bishop of Constantinople oversaw not just faith, but urban stability. His sermons were public addresses. His donations shaped public loyalty. In a world where emperors changed frequently, bishops provided continuity. They had ledgers, grain stores, building plans. They had power and they had records. Byzantium, a paper empire of saints and scribes. By the end of the 6th century, the Byzantine government was neither fully sacred nor secular. It was a fusion. Edicts opened with prayers. Tax laws cited scriptural precedents. Legal scribes quoted church fathers. Emperors built churches as state monuments. If you worked in the bureaucracy, you needed to know canon law just as much as civil code. If you worked in the church, you needed to know tax policy just as much as theology. This was not a theological empire with administrative trappings. It was an administrative empire with theological layers, and it ran on scrolls, ink, signatures, and seals. But we must ask, did this fusion of church and state create a more stable empire or a more rigid one? Could law and faith truly share the same desk, or was Byzantium building a bureaucracy too sacred to reform? By the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire had become something wholly unique, a Christian imperial bureaucracy that ran on both paper and prayer. Emperors issued theological edicts, bishops mediated civil disputes, monasteries copied legal codes, bureaucrats attended church councils. The sacred and the civic were now inseparable gears in the same machine. But how did this complex hybrid actually operate in practice? This section explores the mechanics of the Byzantine church-state apparatus. how heresies were hunted, how monks wielded political weight, how imperial administrators implemented theology, and how this sacred bureaucracy was recorded, reviewed, and rigorously maintained. The rise of religious administration. The spiritual authority of the Church became increasingly codified in imperial law. The Codex Justinianus, part of the larger Corpus Juris Civilis, issued under Emperor Justinian I around 529–534 CE, was the ultimate fusion of church and state policy. It declared Orthodox Christianity as the only legal faith, required all imperial subjects to adhere to Nicene Chalcedonian doctrine, punished heresy with exile, confiscation, or capital punishment, established the legal precedents of ecclesiastical courts. The law code, compiled by Juris Tribonian, included entire books devoted to church hierarchy, bishop appointment procedures, and the handling of heretical clergy. In effect, theology became codified policy, enforceable by the same apparatus that managed taxes and military orders. Bishops as imperial appointees. Though technically elected by clergy and laity, bishop appointments were increasingly influenced or directly controlled by the emperor. The Bishop of Constantinople, for instance, required imperial confirmation, and the emperor had veto power over any nomination he disliked. The same was true in major cities like Alexandria and Antioch. This meant bishops became agents of imperial policy, reporters of local unrest, conduits for state edicts. They received imperial stipends. They filed reports. They attended councils not just as theologians but as quasi-administrators. A bishop could be a powerful ally or a dangerous critic. To the Byzantine Emperor, bishops were trusted intermediaries, but also official liabilities if they leaned toward dissenting theological factions. Heresy as a bureaucratic problem. Heresy in the Byzantine Empire was not only a religious issue, it was a logistical challenge. When a new theological position emerged, say, Monophysitism, the belief that Christ has only one nature, divine, or Nestorianism, the belief that Christ's human and divine natures were distinct, the imperial response was multi-tiered and procedural. Step 1. Definition. A council was convened. Bishops debated, scribes recorded, and a formal doctrinal ruling was issued. Step 2. Legislation. The emperor issued an edict enforcing the decision. Heretical writings were banned. Churches holding incorrect doctrine were confiscated. Step 3. Enforcement. Governors were tasked with implementing the decree. They expelled bishops, oversaw confiscations, and sometimes burned texts. Step 4. Documentation. The decisions were copied into law codes, distributed to regional authorities, and stored in imperial archives. This wasn't religious spontaneity. It was a full administrative process complete with penalties, appeals, and logistical nightmares. Monasticism and the bureaucracy of silence. While bishops were public figures, monks became the private conscience of the empire, and sometimes its quiet critics. Monasteries served as archives, preserving legal texts, correspondence, and theological works. Operated schools that trained future clerics and bureaucrats. Acted as informal courts, especially in rural areas. Monks wrote letters to emperors, filed petitions to synods, and occasionally sparked doctrinal revolts. For example, during the iconoclast controversy, 8th–9th centuries, many monks refused to comply with imperial edicts banning religious images. They wrote treatises, hid icons, and refused to sign official documents. Some were arrested, others were exiled. But in refusing, they preserved dissent in written form, keeping the memory of theological opposition alive, not through protest, but through meticulously copied manuscripts. The state records of the sacred. The The bureaucracy documented everything. Bishoprics were registered with imperial ministries. Monasteries had to file charters typica, describing their rules, property holdings, and funding sources. Church disputes were filed in acts or minutes of synodal meetings stored in state archives. Imperial officials received training in ecclesiastical law. Chancery officials maintained duplicate copies of church edicts, kept in codices bound in leather, filed, alongside military orders and taxation records. Some of the preserved church-related administrative texts include petitions from monasteries for land protection, legal rulings on disputes between bishops and governors, court records from heresy trials, complete with witness lists and verdicts. This paper trail created a world where the divine was managed like a department. Charity, welfare, and sacred logistics. By the 6th century, many public welfare functions had shifted to church institutions, but they still operated under imperial oversight. Charitable services included hospitals xenodokia, often attached to monasteries, leprosaria, providing long-term care for the diseased, orphanages, administered by deacons and widows. Funding came from church donations, but also imperial grants, often tax exemptions or direct grain allowances. These welfare institutions were subject to annual audits by local administrators, charter reviews ensuring doctrinal adherence, inspections for misappropriation or fraud. In practice, charity was never free. It was regulated, documented, and structured to reflect both Christian virtue and imperial control. The emperor as icon. The Byzantines believed in a political theology where the emperor was God's image on earth. This idea didn't emerge from sermons alone, it was built into the paperwork. Coins featured the emperor in divine robes, often with a cross. Legal decrees opened with appeals to divine wisdom. Council rulings referred to the emperor as our most pious and God-guarded sovereign. Imperial legitimacy was expressed through liturgical titles, and those titles were written into law, policy, and daily governance. The state didn't just invoke the divine. It performed it, stamped it, and copied it into the official record. But consider this. Could an empire built on such a tight weave of theology and governance survive reform, or would pulling a single thread cause the whole system to unravel? Was Byzantine bureaucracy the savior of orthodoxy or its strangler? By the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer debating whether church and state should work together. That question had long since been settled. The more pressing issue was, what happens when the church and state disagree? And worse still, what if they need each other but no longer trust one another? This final section explores the cost of the church-state fusion, how theological enforcement strained imperial authority, how emperors lost control of doctrine, and how the sacred bureaucracy, once a tool of unity, became a source of fragmentation and crisis. Because a system designed to keep society ordered can become brittle when challenged, especially when its foundations are half gospel, half edict. The iconoclast controversy, bureaucracy against belief. In the 8th century, Emperor Leo III issued a sweeping edict. Icons' religious images were to be removed, destroyed, or covered. Churches were stripped bare. Monasteries were raided. Clergy who resisted were punished. This wasn't mere icon smashing. It was a bureaucratic operation. Imperial inspectors were sent to verify icon removal. New regulations were added to law codes, criminalizing image veneration. Church property was confiscated from monasteries that refused compliance. Petitions flowed into Constantinople from offended bishops and abbots. The church was split between iconoclasts, image breakers, and iconodules, image venerators. The imperial court supported one side, much of the clergy the other. Yet rather than resolving the issue with persuasion or compromise, the state relied on paperwork and coercion edicts, trials, banishments. The empire's sacred bureaucracy, built to preserve orthodoxy, now enforced division. Monasteries, resistance in silence and ink. While bishops were often replaced or bribed, monks could not be so easily moved. They resisted the iconoclast policy with quiet defiance. Hiding icons, copying banned texts, refusing to sign loyalty oaths. Some were arrested, tortured, or exiled. Yet many continued their work, especially in remote monasteries like Stoudios or in the isolated hills of Cappadocia. Their resistance was not dramatic, but recorded. The typica, monastic rules and registers of the era, contain veiled references to persecution. Marginal notes in biblical manuscripts sometimes include bitter commentary about imperial policies. In this way, faith survived through form through clerical bookkeeping, preserved letters, and encoded dissent. Restoration and reconciliation. In 843 CE, after nearly a century of conflict, Empress Theodora officially restored the veneration of icons. This event, known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, is still commemorated in the Eastern Orthodox Church. But reconciliation came with administrative repair work. Church lands had to be returned. Bishops were reinstated or replaced. Laws passed during the iconoclast period were repealed. Monasteries had to be resanctioned and resupplied. The state didn't just declare a return to orthodoxy. It had to logistically undo 4 generations of theological policy. The bureaucracy was not flexible. It had to be bent back into shape, one edict at a time. Imperial control weakens. After the iconoclast controversy, emperors began losing their once solid control over church affairs. Patriarchs, archbishops of Constantinople, grew more powerful and more independent. Church councils were increasingly convened, without imperial initiative. Monasteries amassed wealth and land, exempt from many taxes. Popular piety icons, saints, pilgrimages could resist imperial rationalism. The state had created a church bureaucracy so complex that it began functioning without needing the emperor's daily input. When future emperors tried to rein in religious practices, they often found themselves outmaneuvered not by armies, but by canon lawyers and abbots fluent in imperial procedure. The Phocian Schism and the road to East-West division. In the 9th century, another crisis emerged, the Phocian Schism. Patriarch Photius, a brilliant scholar and bureaucrat, was appointed under questionable circumstances while his predecessor, Ignatius, was still alive. Rome protested. The Pope excommunicated Photius. In turn, Photius excommunicated the Pope. While this was a religious dispute, it followed a bureaucratic script. Legal arguments were compiled and circulated. Letters were dispatched to other patriarchs and bishops. Appeals were made to both the emperor and Roman officials. It was the first major rupture between Constantinople and Rome, one that foreshadowed the Great Schism of 1054, when the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches formally split. But beneath the theology was a story of procedural power, legal technicalities, and rival clerical administrations. The sacred bureaucracy had grown so large, so institutionalized, that even the empire could no longer control it. Law and doctrine entangled. As Byzantine society advanced into the 10th and 11th centuries, the fusion of church and state began producing unintended contradictions. Civil law sometimes contradicted canon law, especially regarding marriage, property rights, or sanctuary. Church courts ruled on cases of blasphemy or heresy, while imperial courts ruled on related but secular charges. Monks refused to fight in the army, even as their wealth was taxed to support military campaigns. Every attempt to clarify these contradictions produced more laws, more councils, more paperwork. By the 11th century, the Byzantine legal code was saturated with theology, and theology was written in the language of law. Each was a mirror of the other, and neither could be reformed without unsettling the whole. Sacred rituals, secular consequences. The fusion extended into daily life. Imperial coronations were now sacred rituals, presided over by patriarchs and filled with religious symbols. Legal contracts often began with prayers and invoked the protection of saints. Military campaigns were launched with blessings, and failure was attributed not to strategy, but to divine displeasure. This created a world where political legitimacy depended on doctrinal purity and vice versa. And it left little room for error, ambiguity, or dissent. Reflection, the blessing and the burden. The Byzantine model of church-state union was not uniquely flawed. It held the empire together in crisis. It provided moral clarity, social services, and cultural unity. But it also produced inflexibility in times of theological debate, bureaucratic paralysis in reform, alienation of dissident populations, like Monophysites in Egypt or Nestorians in Mesopotamia, a state that could neither fully govern the church nor exist without it. In binding itself to faith, Byzantium inherited both the strength of conviction and the weight of dogma. And one must finally wonder, was Byzantium's sacred bureaucracy a shield or a cage? And when belief is written in law, can an empire ever truly change? Story 4. The Grain Tax in Egypt, How Bread Fed an Empire. Picture yourself in Egypt in the early 5th century CE. The annual flooding of the Nile has just begun to recede. You're a tenant farmer, standing ankle-deep in thick black soil, sowing grain into land that's been prepared the same way for centuries. In the distance, a local official on horseback observes the fields with a wax tablet in hand. He is not admiring the view, he is calculating tax. This isn't just about your family's survival. Your wheat is destined for Constantinople, hundreds of miles away. You are not just a farmer. You are part of a machine, the grain tax system, one of the most essential, yet least glamorous, forces that kept the Eastern Roman Empire running. Bread was not just food. It was politics, logistics, and imperial survival. And Egypt, dusty, ancient, and administratively precise, was its beating heart. Why Egypt? Egypt had been Rome's breadbasket since Augustus annexed it in 30 BCE. By the Byzantine period, it was more important than ever. The Nile's flood cycle created predictable agricultural output. Egyptian farmers had mastered techniques for high-yield grain farming. The land was flat, irrigated, and intensively cultivated. Grain could be transported via the Nile and the Mediterranean with relative ease. Unlike other provinces, Egypt was treated almost like an imperial estate. It had a separate administrative structure, and its prefect was directly appointed by the emperor. No Senate interference, no provincial governors. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was centralized control over survival. The annona system, tax in kind. In the Byzantine world, taxation didn't always involve money. In many regions, especially Egypt, taxes were paid in kind: wheat, barley, wine, oil, and livestock. This system was known as the annona. Here how it worked. Census and registration. Every few years, a census recorded who owned or leased what land. Tenants were assigned quotas based on the size and fertility of their holdings. Assessment and requisition. At harvest, tax officials arrived to inspect and calculate how much grain was due. It wasn't a fixed amount, it varied with flood levels, reported yields, and prior arrears. Storage and collection. Grain was stored in state granaries, horia, throughout Egypt, especially near river ports like Memphis, Oxyrhynchus, and Alexandria. Transport to Constantinople. Once collected, the grain was shipped by barge down the Nile, loaded onto state grain fleets at Alexandria, and then sent across the Mediterranean to state bakeries and depots. This process didn't just feed cities. It fed the military, supported price controls, and allowed emperors to distribute grain during famines to maintain order. Bread kept the capital loyal. Grain as imperial leverage. The Annona system wasn't just about sustenance, it was a tool of control. Grain supplies could be cut off from rebellious provinces. Rations could be increased or decreased in Constantinople, depending on public behavior. Generals were assigned grain quotas for troops. If they failed to secure supply lines, discipline often collapsed. In times of unrest, emperors frequently resorted to bread distributions to pacify the population. These were not gifts, they were calculated acts of survival. A hungry city could become a rebellious one, but a city fed on taxed grain could chant, "Long live the emperor," even in times of war. The life of a grain official. If you were a tax official in Egypt, your life was one of endless paperwork, arguments, and anxiety. You had to inspect fields and assess yields, cross-reference with census records, file collection reports with the central office in Alexandria, supervise grain storage in public granaries, handle petitions from farmers who claimed crop failure, injury, or theft. Mistakes could lead to demotion, exile, or worse. Officials walked a tightrope between imperial expectation and local resentment. In some cases, tax collectors were assaulted or bribed by landowners. In others, they overreported yields to earn favor, resulting in famine when taxes outstripped reality. Farmers, the empire's hidden workforce. Egyptian farmers were rarely freeholders. Most worked as tenant farmers on church or imperial land. Smallholders with fixed tax quotas. Serfs bound to the land through legal obligations. They were taxed regardless of actual yield. If the Nile flooded too little or too much, they were still responsible. Some fled their land. Others joined monastic communities to escape taxation. A few even self-mutilated, cutting off fingers to avoid military or tax service, a disturbing but documented phenomenon in Egyptian papyri. Yet despite hardship, farmers remained indispensable. The entire Eastern Roman fiscal system depended on the reliability of their harvests. Alexandria, the nerve center of grain flow. Byzantine Alexandria was more than a city. It was the gateway between Egypt's fields and Constantinople's tables. At its port, grain was weighed, inspected, and sealed in amphorae or sacks. Official shipping manifests were logged and archived. Fleet captains were assigned by state dispatchers. Weather and sea conditions were monitored to prevent loss. From there, grain was shipped north in imperial convoys, often guarded by navy vessels during times of piracy or conflict. Each shipment was tracked by grain clerks, who filed reports once it arrived in the capital, where it was again measured to ensure no loss or theft had occurred. If quantities didn't match, an investigation began, and someone, somewhere, clerk or captain, paid the price. Bread as a political tool in Constantinople. Once the grain arrived, it wasn't just warehoused, it was transformed. State-run bakeries in Constantinople turned Egyptian wheat into bread, distributed through the Annona civiles, the urban grain dole. This bread went to imperial workers and bureaucrats, soldiers and palace guards, the poor through church-administered charities, urban residents to prevent discontent. Bread was not only sustenance, it was a performance of imperial care. And when the bread failed to arrive due to storms, rebellion, or bureaucratic delay, riots erupted. The quiet collapse of the system. By the 7th century, the system began to fray. The Persian invasion of Egypt in 619-629 disrupted grain flow. Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 ended Byzantine control entirely. Constantinople's food supply shifted to Thrace and the Aegean, but these lands lacked Egypt's reliability. Without Egyptian grain, the Annona system collapsed. The imperial welfare state shrank. Constantinople endured sieges and hunger. Bread lost its political potency. The bureaucratic machinery remained, but its wheels spun without grain to carry. And so one must ask, did the Eastern Roman Empire grow too dependent on a single province, a single river, a single crop? And what happens to an empire when its breadbasket runs dry not from drought, but from conquest? It's the 6th century CE, and you're a junior scribe in Oxyrhynchus, a modest provincial city in Middle Egypt. You sit cross-legged in a low-roofed office lined with scrolls, your fingers stained with ink. The document in front of you is a tax receipt, one of hundreds you'll copy this week. The empire doesn't run on silver, it runs on papyrus. This section explores the hidden infrastructure of record-keeping, bureaucracy, and communication that made the Egyptian grain tax possible. While most people saw fields and bread, what truly held the system together was documentation, the ledgers, rolls, receipts, manifests, audits, and petitions that gave the Eastern Roman state its teeth. If Section 1 was about the physical grain, this is about the paperwork trail it left behind. Papyrus, the lifeblood of bureaucratic Egypt. Before parchment became widespread, papyrus was the primary writing material of the Eastern Empire, especially in Egypt, where it was produced locally and in abundance. Harvested from the cyperus papyrus plant growing along the Nile. Pressed into thin, smooth sheets ideal for short documents. Affordable, available, and efficient. Papyrus wasn't just a writing medium, it was a symbol of administration. Receipts for grain quotas, copies of imperial edicts, summaries of village harvests, letters between clerks, all were penned on papyrus rolls, bundled, archived, and filed in state offices or temples. We know this because tens of thousands of these documents have survived, buried in dry Egyptian soil, particularly in towns like Oxyrhynchus, Hermopolis, and Aphrodito. Grain ledgers, bureaucracy in practice. Each farming district or nome had its own local records office. These were responsible for maintaining tax registers, lists of all landholders and their expected grain payments. Delivery logs, records confirming when grain was brought to the depot and in what quantity. Receipts, issued to farmers, signed and stamped by scribes, sometimes with witness names. Transfer notes, tracking grain as it moved between silos, barges, and storage vessels. Petitions and appeals, requests for tax reduction, deadline extensions, or remeasurement of land. The language of these documents was mostly Greek, the lingua franca of administration. Occasionally, documents appear in Coptic, particularly those related to church-run estates. The forms were standardized. Formats mattered. There were set formulas for opening and closing a document, invoking the emperor and citing local law. If you skipped a line or misplaced a date, your receipt might be void and your grain counted twice. The bureaucrat's toolkit. A typical mid-level grain administrator in Egypt had a wax tablet and stylus for temporary notes, a set of ink pens, sharpened reeds dipped in black or red ink, scrolls of past year's ledgers, stored in clay jars or linen wrappings, seals or lead bully to stamp documents for authenticity, a locked chest with grain measure weights, used to verify deliveries. They also had access to local enforcers, men who ensured compliance and arrested tax dodgers. These officials were not soldiers. They were scribes with the power to ruin you or forgive you, depending on how their ledgers balanced. Village bureaucracy, where the empire met the farmer. Though the system was imperial, it was run locally. Each village appointed scribes grammates and elders presbyteroi to mediate between the farmers and the state. Their tasks: compile annual yield estimates, measure plots of land using cords and pegs, conduct interviews with farmers, record crop loss or flood damage, file preliminary tax rolls. They also wrote petitions for their neighbors, often in a carefully worded, formulaic Greek. To the most illustrious comes an overseer of grain transport, from Theon, a humble farmer of the village of Temenauthus. Owing to the poor inundation this year and my infirmity, I request postponement of the grain levy. Some were honest brokers. Others were corrupt, inflating numbers, skimming grain, or charging extra for favorable reports. Still, without them, the tax machine could not function. Monasteries and church estates, parallel bureaucracies. By the 6th century, many Egyptian farms were under the control of monasteries or church-run estates. These lands were legally taxable, but often enjoyed preferential treatment. Monasteries had their own scribes and record-keepers, granaries and silos, labor contracts with tenant farmers, direct correspondence with Alexandria and sometimes Constantinople. Their records were preserved in monastic archives, many of which still survive, often hidden in walls, buried in courtyards, or stored with sacred relics. These records show exact calculations of grain production, detailed lists of donations to the poor, logs of imperial correspondence and edicts received. The church, in other words, mirrored the imperial bureaucracy, sometimes competing with it, sometimes cooperating. Grain logistics, coordinated by scroll. Moving millions of kilograms of grain was not done by guesswork. It required synchronized communication. Dispatch orders issued from Alexandria to Nile port stations. Captain logs tracking how many sacks of grain were loaded. Customs forms at Mediterranean harbors, stamped and sealed. Delivery manifests sent to Constantinople weeks in advance. Delays or losses triggered inquiries. Grain shortfalls led to imperial memoranda requesting explanations from provincial governors. If grain spoiled in storage, someone had to file a spoilage report, including causes, flood, mold, rat infestation, and recommended penalties. A single late shipment could trigger dozens of scrolls. When the system failed, of course, not everything worked perfectly. Problems included double taxation due to overlapping registers, forged receipts to avoid paying quotas, mistranslation of petitions, especially from Coptic speakers, falsified weights and measures. To address these, periodic audits were conducted by officials from Alexandria or even Constantinople. These audits involved comparing local records to regional summaries, conducting remeasurement of land, interviewing villagers under oath, inspecting grain quality in silos. Punishments ranged from fines to exile. Occasionally, large-scale fraud prompted imperial investigations and sweeping revisions of the bureaucracy. Legacy in the dirt. When Arab forces conquered Egypt in the 640s, they inherited not only fields but filing cabinets, or rather, baskets of scrolls. The new rulers quickly saw the value of the grain tax system. They retained much of the Byzantine administrative structure, including tax quotas and village registers, for decades after the conquest. In fact, much of what we know about Byzantine Egypt comes not from imperial libraries, but from discarded papyrus, buried under the sand, used to wrap mummies, or simply forgotten in abandoned tax offices. The bureaucracy, even in death, preserved itself. And yet, what was it all for? So many scrolls, so many signatures, so many lives measured in sacks of grain and lines of ink. Was it justice or survival? Was it tyranny, or the only way an empire could manage millions of mouths? You are a grain clerk in Alexandria, and it's the early 7th century. Your records have been delayed. The Nile flood was lower this year and the barge teams are late. Meanwhile, your orders from Constantinople remain unchanged. Ship 8,000 modi of wheat before the month's end. But there is less grain, fewer workers, and a rising sense of uncertainty. Outside your office, rumors spread. The Persians have captured nearby provinces. The roads feel less safe. And while the imperial banner still flies above the harbor, many wonder for how much longer. This final section explores how imperial reliance on Egypt's grain system became a fatal weakness, and how the collapse of this once invisible infrastructure led to real hunger, political collapse, and civil reorientation. It ends with a reflection on how fragile even the most efficient systems become when their roots are political, agricultural, and logistical all at once. Egypt under siege, the Persian invasion. In 619 CE, during the final decades of the Emperor Heraclius, Persian armies invaded and occupied Egypt, the most significant blow to Byzantine logistics in over 2 centuries. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Grain shipments from Egypt to Constantinople stopped. Granaries along the Nile were looted or burned. Tax officials fled, destroying records as they went. The Cursus Clibinarius, the official shipping fleet, was halted, dismantled, or lost at sea. For the first time in living memory, Constantinople went hungry. Grain had always been there. Now it was. In a city where bread was not just food but a civic right, the loss sparked panic, inflation, and the breakdown of urban welfare. Desperation in the capital. With the Annona disrupted, Constantinople had to adapt. Emergency procurement of grain from Thrace and Anatolia began, but these regions lacked the volume or consistency of Egypt. The government implemented strict rationing. Bakeries operated at reduced capacity, feeding only military and essential personnel. Monasteries increased local charity, but even their reserves ran low. The Emperor Heraclius faced political and military disaster. He could no longer promise food security and therefore no longer claim divine favor. The crisis revealed the truth. An empire can be vast, strong, and well organized, but it only functions when it is fed. Victory and a hollow recovery. In 629 CE, Heraclius managed to retake Egypt after a stunning military campaign against the Persians. Imperial scribes and clerks returned. Officials set about rebuilding tax rolls, recommissioning granaries, and re-establishing shipping schedules. But the recovery was hollow. Many villages had been depopulated. Harvest cycles had been missed or disrupted. Fields were overgrown or salted. Monasteries had taken over tax collection and refused to cooperate fully. Worse still, trust in the central government had eroded. Farmers who once saw the Byzantine state as a guarantor of food and safety now saw it as an absentee landlord, demanding grain but offering little in return. And the window for restoration was short. The Arab conquest, grain lost forever. In 641 CE, Egypt fell again, this time to the Rashidun Caliphate, led by Amr ibn al-As. Alexandria capitulated after a short siege. The Byzantine Empire would never again control Egypt. For the imperial administration, this was not just a military loss, but a systemic collapse. The Annona grain routes were permanently severed. Imperial granaries in Alexandria were abandoned. The grain fleets were repurposed or lost entirely. Thousands of clerks, scribes, and administrators were displaced. Egypt's new rulers maintained some grain infrastructure, but it served different ends. Grain now flowed eastward to Medina and Damascus, not north to Constantinople. The Byzantine capital now depended on domestic agriculture, less fertile, more politically unstable, and less centralized. The shrinking of the welfare state. With Egypt gone, the empire's grain-based welfare system disintegrated. Free bread distributions were phased out. Public bakeries were shuttered or privatized. Church-based welfare expanded, but could not match earlier scales. The urban poor began to disperse, shrinking Constantinople's population. What had once been a strategic food network became a memory. State stability, once tied to reliable bread supply, now depended on fragile alliances, coinage, and tax negotiation. The empire survived but changed. From this point forward, Byzantium looked inward, focusing on Anatolia and the Balkans, shifting from maritime empire to fortress society. The administrative ghost. Though the grain no longer came, the bureaucracy remained for a while. Scribes copied old Annona regulations well into the 8th century. Local tax rolls in Egypt were preserved by monasteries, even under Islamic rule. Legal manuals still referenced imperial grain transport that no longer existed. In this sense, the system lived on as a ghost, its presence felt in procedures, paperwork, and institutional memory, even as its real-world function collapsed. It's a haunting irony. The records outlasted the grain they once tracked. Bread as a broken promise. For centuries, Byzantium's grain system was a promise between emperor and people, ruler and farmer, state and stomach. It promised food security, fiscal order, social peace, divine legitimacy. When it worked, the empire thrived. When it broke, the consequences were not just physical but psychological. Trust unraveled, cities emptied, people stopped believing the state could provide. And perhaps more than swords, ships, or sermons, that loss of trust marked the beginning of Byzantium's slow transformation into a different kind of empire. Final reflection: the empire that ate itself. What happened to Byzantium's grain tax system is not a mystery of war or politics. It is a story of dependence, precision, and vulnerability. It worked until it didn't. It fed millions until it couldn't. It kept the peace until it vanished. And like so much in history, it faded not in flames but in mildew and dust, scrolls left unclaimed, granaries left unfilled, and bakeries gone silent. But we might still ask, did Byzantium fall because of military defeat, or because it bet its future on the predictability of a single river, a single harvest, and a system too delicate to survive disruption? And in our own time, are the systems we rely on any less fragile? Story 5. A Life of Scrolls and Dust, the Scribes Who Wrote Byzantium. The year is 895 CE, and you are a scribe in a dim corner of the imperial chancery in Constantinople. Your workday begins at dawn. The candles are still flickering. Your elbow aches from yesterday's copying, and you have ink under every fingernail. The task today: 3 imperial rescripts, 1 copy of a bishop's property dispute, and a clean transcription of last week's military report from the Anatolican theme. You're not famous. You're not a noble, a priest, or a soldier, but without you, the empire would forget itself. This story is about the invisible men, and occasionally women, who preserved, transmitted, and defined the Byzantine world one line of text at a time. Not through war or conquest, but through diligence, repetition, and dust-covered scrolls. What was a Byzantine scribe? A scribe, grammatius, notarios, or chartularios, depending on their office, was not just a person who wrote. They were recorders of law, theology, military orders, and fiscal transactions, preservers of classical Greek and Roman texts, transcribers of liturgy, philosophy, hagiography, and science, functionaries who maintained the state's institutional memory. Some were monks in scriptoria. Others were civil servants in the sprawling Byzantine bureaucracy. A few were imperial scribes with access to palace secrets. What united them was a life spent hunched over parchment, eyes squinting, often copying documents they would never fully read, but without which no administration, no theology, and no culture could survive. The places where Byzantium was written. Scribes worked in specific locations, each with its own function. The imperial chancery, Sacrum Scrinium, located within the imperial palace complex, produced decrees, legal codes, imperial letters. Staffed by elite scribes with legal training. Monastic scriptoria, found in monasteries like Staudios, Mount Athos, and Syene. Copied religious texts, classical literature, and saints' lives. Scribes here saw copying as a spiritual act. Provincial archives, located in diocesan and theme headquarters. Maintained local tax records, property documents, and military rosters. Church archives. Patriarchal scribes handled council records, canon law, and church decrees. Documents were stored in chests, codices, and wooden tubes. Each place had its own rules, training systems, and writing tools, but all depended on precision, concentration, and painstaking attention to detail. A day in the life of a scribe. Your day starts early. You sharpen your reed pen with a knife. You mix ink from soot, water, and gum arabic, or use iron gall ink from oak galls. Your supervisor assigns your task, perhaps copying a land grant from the emperor to a monastery. You lay out your parchment, stretching it flat and securing it with weights. You draw guidelines with a stylus, then begin the slow process of transcription. Errors were not tolerated. A single mistake could result in legal confusion, doctrinal heresy, or even military misdirection. Scribes developed elaborate abbreviations to save space and calligraphic flourishes for official documents. Some became artists, designing illuminated capitals or decorative margins, though most did unadorned administrative work, destined to be shelved and forgotten. Tools of the trade. A scribe's toolkit was modest but essential. Reed pens, calamite, trimmed daily. Ink pots, sometimes with multiple colors. Parchment or papyrus, often scraped and reused. Rulers and compasses for layout. Penknives for sharpening, scraping errors, and cutting pages. Wax tablets for drafting and temporary notes. Lead-point styluses for ruling margins. Good scribes guarded their tools jealously. Ink stains were worn like badges of honor or proof of punishment if work was sloppy. Writing for survival, scribes, and bureaucracy. The Byzantine state depended on paperwork not metaphorically, but literally. The flow of grain, troops, money, and people was governed by written orders. Scribes produced imperial edicts, prostagma, land deeds, practica, tax assessments, census rolls, military dispatches, court verdicts, church council records. Many of these had to be produced in duplicate or triplicate, signed, sealed, and filed in different locations: Constantinople, the local theme capital, and a monastery archive. This duplication created redundancy and resilience. Even if one archive burned, another might preserve the record. Monks as memory keepers. In monastic scriptoria, the work of the scribe took on sacred meaning. Copying scripture, sermons, or saintly biographies was an act of devotion. Scribes began their work with prayer, asked forgiveness for mistakes, and often added personal notes in the margins. I have written this with a trembling hand, by the mercy of God, though the light was poor and my fingers frozen. These monks preserved not only Christian texts, but also pagan Greek philosophy, medicine, and science, often unaware that centuries later, these works would be rediscovered in Western Europe as the seeds of the Renaissance. In this sense, the monastic scribe was a time traveler writing not for his own day, but for the world to come. Women in the shadows. Although most scribes were men, especially in official and ecclesiastical roles, Some women participated in copying texts, particularly in convents or aristocratic households. Evidence from marginal notes and surviving manuscripts suggests women copied liturgical texts, taught writing to novices, maintained estate records, composed correspondence on behalf of noblewomen. They left few names, but their hands are still visible in delicate script, careful spacing, and the occasional frustrated comment like, "This parchment was poor and the ink worse. May the reader forgive the hand." The weight of preservation. Byzantine scribes understood they were preserving something more than text. They were preserving continuity. Between emperor and subject, between bishop and believer, between past and future. A tax record might outlive a governor. A sermon might survive a siege. A theological treatise might disappear for centuries and then re-emerge in a scholar's hands. The act of copying was slow, silent, and lonely, but it was also resilient. But what did it all mean? Scribes rarely questioned the systems they served. They didn't write their own names, didn't sign their work, didn't seek recognition. And yet, they preserved the very identity of Byzantium. Without them, there would be no laws, no letters, no gospels, no memories. And still we wonder, if every scribe had stopped writing just for a single season, how long would the empire have lasted? Would Byzantium have collapsed not with fire, but with silence? Byzantium was a civilization of ink, but even in the most disciplined scriptoria, mistakes were inevitable. Whether in the imperial chancery or a monastic cell, scribes faced a constant battle not against heretics or invaders, but against fatigue, ambiguity, and the slow drift of meaning. This section explores the imperfections of the scribe's craft, how errors crept in, how texts were edited or distorted, and how the consequences of a misplaced letter could ripple through law, theology, and memory. It's a reminder that empires can fall not only by sword or siege, but by a copyist's hand shaking slightly in the dark. When one word changes everything. The most dangerous errors were not omissions, but small, subtle alterations. A single letter added or removed from a Greek word could shift meaning. A misspelling in a legal document might cause land to change hands. An ambiguous abbreviation could make a saint sound like a sinner. Take the Greek word homoousios, letter 1F41 mu omicron omicron upsilon sigma iota omicron sigma, of the same substance, used to describe the relationship between Christ and God the Father, mistakenly copied as homoousios, letter 1F41 mu omicron io omicron upsilon sigma iota omicron sigma. Of similar substance, it fueled decades of theological controversy. It wasn't just theology. Laws regarding property, marriage, and tax could be invalidated by transcription errors. A land grant's location miswritten. The field goes to the wrong owner. A name miscopied. A soldier doesn't receive his pay. And unlike oral mistakes, written errors became permanent until someone spotted and corrected them, if they ever did. The scribal note, an editor's whisper. Many scribes were keenly aware of their own fallibility. They developed ways to comment, clarify, or quietly confess. Marginalia notes in the margins, often apologetic or explanatory. Forgive me, reader, the light was fading. This passage is obscure. I copied as I found it. Colophon's closing statements added at the end of manuscripts. I, Theodoros, copied this book in the year of our Lord 945, after many days without rest. Some scribes even argued with their source text, noting suspected errors or alternate readings in the margin. Others debated theology in footnotes, adding small glosses to clarify or challenge earlier views. These voices are faint, anonymous, but they offer a glimpse of a thinking, reflective class of workers, not mere machines. Scribal schools and copying culture. In Constantinople and key monasteries, scribal education was taken seriously. Young men, and occasionally women, were trained in Orthography, correct spelling. Grammar and syntax. Paleography, writing styles and scripts. Abbreviation systems. Rhetorical devices, especially for religious texts. There was often a master scribe who checked each copy. Mistakes were corrected in red ink or scraped clean with a knife and rewritten. Yet in provincial towns, training varied. A poorly taught scribe could introduce generations of errors simply by being diligent but incorrect. Scribal culture prized consistency, but it wasn't immune to laziness, carelessness, or simple fatigue. After all, many copied for 12 hours a day, in rooms too hot or too cold under the pressure of deadlines. Deliberate alteration, copyists as editors. Not all changes were accidental. Sometimes scribes deliberately edited texts to align with current theology, e.g., editing older homilies to reflect new doctrinal rulings, to clarify confusing passages, especially in translations from Latin or Syriac, to remove offensive or heretical material, particularly in hagiographies and church histories, to insert imperial propaganda, glorifying emperors or reinforcing orthodoxy. This editorial hand was invisible: no red pen, no citation. Just a new version, cleaner, clearer, and no longer original. It makes modern historians cautious. How many surviving texts are authentic, and how many are Byzantine remixes? And who made those choices? Legal and religious implications of scribal mistakes. The Byzantine Empire had a legal procedure for copying errors. If a mistake was discovered in a public document, like a contract or land grant, it could be corrected by a notary with margin notes, voided, requiring a full reissue, disputed in court if ownership or identity was affected. Church texts had even higher stakes. A scribe who copied a theological treatise incorrectly could be accused of heresy, be removed from monastic office, face public censure, even excommunication. This created pressure. Accuracy wasn't just a virtue, it was a legal and spiritual obligation. In this system, a scribe was not just copying. He was responsible for both content and consequence. The hidden scribes of the themes. In the Byzantine themes, the military districts that doubled as administrative unit scribes played critical roles. Each theme had a logothete, financial officer, with subordinate scribes, military scribes, tracking supplies, payments, and troop movements, tax clerks, issuing receipts and maintaining village quotas. These scribes worked in isolation from Constantinople, using copies of law codes, imperial edicts, and doctrinal summaries, all written and transmitted by other scribes. When they made errors, they didn't just affect paperwork, they could disrupt local economies or fuel rebellion. Yet they remain almost entirely unnamed. We know them only by their work, the same hand writing in the margins of tax rolls, monastery charters, and army supply lists, year after year. When scribes disappear. What happens when scribes vanish? We know from periods of war, plague, and economic collapse that scribal work slowed or stopped. During the plague of Justinian, many archives fell silent. In the 7th century, Arab invasions led to the loss of scribal institutions in Egypt and Syria. After the 1204 Latin sack of Constantinople, entire generations of scribal training and records were lost. Each gap in the record wasn't just a loss of text, it was a loss of institutional memory, legal continuity, cultural coherence. Empires, after all, don't just need soldiers and walls. They need people who remember the rules and write them down. And what do we remember of them? Scribes did not write their own stories, but we see them in the margins, in the colophons, in the sudden dip of ink when the candle went out. They were tired, overlooked, and often silent, but they were the nervous system of the Byzantine body. Without them there is no empire, only ruins and empty shelves. But still we must ask, what happens when those who preserve memory are themselves forgotten? What remains of a civilization when its scribes no longer have ink or reason to write? The candles are low. The scribe's hand trembles slightly. He has been copying the same passage for days, a theological commentary by a long-dead patriarch, meant for a bishop who may never read it. The parchment curls slightly at the edges. Outside, the wind carries the sound of distant bells, but still he writes. It is the 14th century, and Byzantium is no longer an empire of sweeping armies and grand ceremonies. It is a shadow of its former self, reduced, inward, encircled. And yet, in quiet corners of monasteries and crumbling chancelleries, scribes still work, still preserve, still copy. This final section follows the scribal tradition through its last centuries, showing how it adapted, survived, and ultimately transformed as the Byzantine world approached its twilight. It also reflects on what was saved and what was lost when the scribes finally put down their pens. The changing face of Byzantine writing. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the scribal world was shifting. The Komnenian emperors, 1081–1185, emphasized military bureaucracy over literary culture. The imperial chancery still operated, but court scribes became court flatterers, producing panegyrics rather than law codes. Monastic scriptoria remained active, particularly on Mount Athos and in Constantinople, but they focused increasingly on internal monastic life rather than imperial administration. Still, some important literary revivals occurred. The Macedonian Renaissance, 9th–11th centuries, saw a renewed interest in classical texts, many recopied or preserved by scribes with remarkable accuracy. Scholars like Michael Sellos and Anna Komnene relied on scribes to draft and redraft their treatises and histories. Scribes in this period became more than mere copyists. They became editors, collaborators, and cultural curators. But they also became rarer. The Latin sack of 1204, ink spilled in the streets. In 1204, Latin crusaders captured Constantinople, looting churches, homes, and archives. The imperial library, rich with centuries of scribed texts, was pillaged. Scrolls were torn apart, burned, or sold in Western markets. Many scribes were killed or displaced, forced to flee to Nicaea, Thessalonica, or monasteries deep in the interior, or simply absorbed into the Latin administrative structure. The trauma was immense. Entire archives, legal, theological, medical, vanished. Those that survived often did so by accident, hidden in monasteries, forgotten in provincial churches, or shipped west as curiosities. The scribes who survived kept writing, but now with an awareness that their civilization was imperiled. Every copy might be the last. The late Byzantine period, quiet persistence. From 1261 onward, when the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople, scribes continued their work but on a smaller scale. Monks became the primary preservers of texts. Secular scribes dwindled, state bureaucracy grew thinner. Emperors like Andronikos II and Manuel II supported literary activity, but their resources were limited. Still, small scriptoria flourished. In Mount Athos, entire generations of scribes trained in calligraphy, textual criticism, and bookbinding. They continued to copy. Liturgical texts, commentaries on Aristotle and the Church Fathers, classical works of Homer, Plato, and Galen, historical chronicles, some compiled by the scribes themselves. One such scribe, Theodore of Thessaloniki, lamented in a colophon, "The ink has faded, the empire flickers, but we write so that the light might return." Byzantium's final years, a dying flame. By the early 15th century, the empire was a city-state Constantinople, ringed by Ottoman territories, dependent on foreign aid and crumbling internally. Yet scribes still wrote. In the patriarchal school, scholars trained in copying texts for theological study. In private homes, aristocratic families paid scribes to copy family histories or liturgical calendars. Emperors like Manuel II Paleologos, a scholar himself, dictated letters and treatises to scribes during diplomatic missions. But it was clear the tradition was ending. There were fewer pens, fewer students, parchment grew expensive, ink dried, scrolls sat unread. And still, some scribes refused to stop. May 1453, the last scribe of Constantinople. We do not know his name, but one monk, likely on Mount Athos or within the city walls, copied a biblical commentary in the spring of 1453. At the end of the manuscript, he wrote, "I write these lines as the city prepares for war. May this book endure, even if I do not." On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell to maimed II. The Byzantine Empire as a political entity ceased to exist. But many texts survived. Libraries were seized, not burned. The Ottoman Empire came to value Greek scholars and scribes, many of whom were employed in imperial archives or Islamic schools. The scribes' work had outlasted the empire. What was preserved, what was lost? Thanks to scribes we have the Corpus Juris Civilis, later foundational for Western law. Nearly complete texts of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and Herodotus. Vast compilations of Byzantine chronicle history. Thousands of hymns, prayers, and commentaries. But much was lost. Medical treatises mentioned in catalogs, but never found. Personal letters and court records that were never recopied. The complete records of imperial councils, many fragmented. Countless local histories and folk narratives. The scribes chose, or were told, what to copy. Those choices became our inheritance and our blind spots. The afterlife of Byzantine scribal culture. Ironically, the fall of Byzantium spread its scribal traditions. Greek scribes fled to Italy, bringing manuscripts and techniques that fueled the Renaissance. Byzantine script influenced the development of early printed Greek typefaces. Monasteries like Mount Athos and Siena became World Heritage Sites, where scholars still study ancient manuscripts. And the careful, detailed practices of Byzantine scribes shaped textual criticism, paleography, and codicology, entire disciplines devoted to the study of old books. In this way, the scribe did not vanish. He simply changed form. Final reflection, scribal silence and historical memory. The Byzantine scribes may not have wielded swords or held crowns, but they wielded something stranger, continuity. They bridged the classical world to the medieval. They preserved ideas during times of darkness and siege. They chose what survived, often unknowingly shaping the modern world. And they did all this in silence, bent over parchment, forgotten by most, remembered only in marginal notes and ink-stained pages. And so we ask, is it possible that the most powerful people of an empire were those who left no monuments, only manuscripts? And if one scribe, in one cold room, had decided not to copy a certain text, would we even know that text ever existed? Story 6. Byzantine bureaucracy, the ministry that never slept. The Byzantine Empire was famously devout, fiercely resilient, and militarily inconsistent. But beneath the incense of the churches and the clashing of swords on distant frontiers, something else made it endure for over 1,000 years. Bureaucracy. Quiet, unrelenting, maddeningly complex, the Byzantine administrative machine was not a side feature of empire. It was the empire itself. While emperors came and went, while enemies raided borders and cities rose or fell, the ministries of Byzantium worked, issuing orders, collecting taxes, settling land disputes, managing grain shipments, and handling the thousands of banal transactions that kept the vast imperial body alive. This was not a bureaucracy of parchment alone. It was made of people logothetes, nodarioi, chartularioi, epitundician, each with titles difficult to translate and duties that often overlapped in frustrating, repetitive, and beautiful ways. This section explores the birth and rise of that Byzantine bureaucracy, not through romantic conquests or glittering coronations, but through forms, registers, and offices that never closed. The roots, from Rome to Constantinople. The Byzantine bureaucratic tradition did not emerge overnight. It was inherited modified from Rome. Diocletian and Constantine had already split the Roman administration into multiple layers of specialized departments. The Praetorian prefectures, dioceses, and provinces were carefully tracked and documented. Taxation, military logistics, grain doles, and road networks were all bureaucratically maintained. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, it took much of its administrative apparatus with it. But in the East, in Constantinople, the machinery of governance continued, albeit with changes. Greek gradually replaced Latin, imperial ceremonial grew more elaborate, and the offices themselves multiplied. By the time of Justinian I.R. 527–565, the Byzantine bureaucracy had already evolved into a formidable structure capable of planning military campaigns and micromanaging the daily affairs of distant provinces. The ministries of the Middle Empire. By the 9th century, the Byzantine state was governed not just by generals and priests, but by a constellation of offices and logothesia, ministries. Some of the key offices included 1. Logothetes. 2. Geniku. The general logothete, responsible for state finance and taxation. This ministry handled tax registers, land, property, inheritance, collection and auditing of provincial revenues, overseeing the minting of coinage, supervising land grants and exemptions. 2. Logothetes. 2. Dramo. Originally the Postmaster General, by the 9th century he oversaw foreign affairs and intelligence. This office managed the empire's spy network, handled diplomatic missions, controlled official travel and courier routes. 3. Sacularios. In charge of the imperial treasury, coordinating finances across multiple departments. 4. Logothetes. 2. Stratioticou. Responsible for military finances, including army payroll, supply procurement, veterans' pensions. 5. Epitundician. Literally, the man of petitions. He received and reviewed petitions from the public to the emperor. He functioned as a filter between the people and power, often wielding significant soft influence. Each of these ministries came with staff, archives, and regional representatives. None operated in isolation. Documents passed between them stamped, copied, commented upon. They were not efficient by modern standards, but they were surprisingly effective, maintaining continuity through war, civil strife, even palace coups. How the machine operated. The bureaucracy ran on 4 essential elements. Documents. Everything was written down: decrees, orders, receipts, approvals, exemptions, censuses. Seals, lead seals or bully authenticated documents. Without a proper seal, a document was meaningless. Hierarchical review. Most documents pass through multiple layers of review and comment before reaching the emperor or regional governors. Archival storage. The empire maintained elaborate archives, especially in Constantinople, some stored in wooden tubes, others in codices or chests. Work was delegated down layers of sub-officials, notaries, assistants, scribes, auditors. Many employees lived entire lives inside the system, entering as young men and retiring after decades of form filling, approval checking, and careful avoidance of imperial wrath. titles, status, and the race for promotion. The Byzantine court loved titles. Bureaucrats were not merely clerks or managers, they were protonotarios, chief notary; chartularios, document handler; referendarios, messenger to the emperor; mystikos, a kind of imperial private secretary; protoscretes, first secretary, head of the imperial secretariat. These titles often came with robes, court ranks, and symbolic privileges. They signified access to power, to the emperor, to the machinery of the state. Promotion was everything. A man might work 20 years for a single step up the hierarchy from assistant in the Genicon to deputy in the Stratioticon. And behind every promotion stood carefully maintained record books, performance reports, and more than a few gifts to superiors. The Byzantine bureaucrat's day. Imagine this. You are a notary in the Logothesian II Genicu. It is the year 1034. Your day begins just before sunrise. You report to the secretary's chamber, where today's petitions, tax ledgers, and dispatches are awaiting review. Tasks include comparing property declarations with older tax registers, forwarding suspicious claims to the sacellarios for auditing, drafting letters for the local strategos, military governor, preparing a financial summary for the imperial court. Lunch is brief: bread, olives, and vinegar wine. Then more scrolls. A delivery of papyrus rolls from Egypt arrives. You mark each for storage in the central archive. Your supervisor dictates a letter to be sent via the Dromos courier system warning of a shortfall in Cappadocian revenues. You draft it, seal it, send it. You return home long after dark. Your wife reminds you to double-check your accounts. A single error and you could be accused of embezzlement. The empire never sleeps, and neither, it seems, does its paperwork. Why it worked? Despite its notorious complexity, the Byzantine bureaucracy succeeded because it was adaptable. Offices evolved over centuries, changing roles and scopes without destroying the system. Durable, archives outlived emperors. Procedures remained constant through dynastic change. Professionalized. Many bureaucrats came from administrative families, trained from youth. Tied to prestige. Service in the ministries offered status and security to the ambitious. It was not democratic, and it could be rigid or corrupt, but it was a machine designed to endure. But could it handle the unexpected? Even the best bureaucracies have limits. When plague struck, records fell out of date. During civil wars, rival factions created competing offices. When borders shifted rapidly, provincial reports became unreliable or contradictory. At times, ministries issued contradictory orders. Taxes were assessed twice or not at all. Soldiers went unpaid because of a misplaced seal. And yet the bureaucracy endured. Like a river, it flowed around obstacles, slowing, swelling, splitting, but never drying up. And we must wonder, could it be that the most resilient part of Byzantium wasn't its armies or its walls, but its filing cabinets? How much of world history is shaped not by kings, but by clerks with keys to locked doors? The Byzantine bureaucracy was not just a system. It was a culture, one that governed not only what people paid and where they traveled, but how power itself functioned in the empire. By the Middle Byzantine period, roughly the 9th-12th centuries, this administrative state had become so deeply entwined with court politics, monastic life, and even military affairs that it is hard to separate one from the other. But as with any great machine, cracks formed. Corruption seeped in, titles became ceremonial, and ministries developed rivalries. More dangerously, some became tools of political intrigue, capable of destroying careers or making them. This section traces the underbelly of Byzantine administration, the subtle methods of fraud, the rivalries between departments, and the political weaponization of paperwork. Bureaucracy was meant to serve the state, but at times, it served ambition instead. Where the paper meant power. In Byzantium, access to the bureaucracy was a form of capital. While emperors technically held absolute authority, in practice, they were often limited by their ministers and officials. The emperor issued commands, yes, but those commands had to be drafted, reviewed, stamped, dispatched, archived. Each step passed through bureaucratic hands, and at each stage, those hands could delay, distort, or reinterpret the emperor's will. It is no coincidence that many of Byzantium's most powerful figures, from eunuchs to patriarchs, began their careers not on the battlefield but behind a desk, managing tax rolls or diplomatic letters. Corruption by design. While the Byzantine state tried to maintain control through inspections and record-keeping, corruption was built into the very structure of the system. Officials were often unpaid or poorly compensated. They were expected to collect unofficial fees to supplement their income. Many posts were bought outright. Families saved for years to purchase minor bureaucratic offices for their sons, hoping for a long-term payoff. Forged documents became a regular problem. Entire offices existed just to review the authenticity of seals and titles. One 10th century monk wrote, "The men in robes wield ink as soldiers wield blades, and their wounds are often more permanent." The strategic use of delay. The empire's administrative delays were legendary. Edicts might take months to reach distant provinces. Tax complaints could languish in review for years. Petitions to the emperor could be rerouted, misplaced, or conveniently ignored. This was not always accidental. Skilled bureaucrats could weaponize delay as a form of power. Opposing a policy, lose the paperwork in review. Undermining a rival, hold their promotions in pending status. Advancing an ally, fast-track approvals and secure appointments. This informal system of favoritism and obstruction created a web of influence far deeper than any official chart. Ministries in rivalry. Though the ministries were all under the imperial umbrella, they often competed for resources, prestige, and influence at court. Key rivalries included Logothetes II Genicu v. Sacolarios. Both dealt with finances. One managed tax revenue, the other oversaw the treasury. Their priorities often clashed. One wanted to maximize revenue. The other wanted to conserve imperial spending. Logothetes II Dramo versus the Epitundician. Both had access to sensitive information, one through foreign intelligence, the other through personal petitions. They competed for who had the emperor's ear on public sentiment and external threats. These rivalries were not just administrative. They often aligned with court factions, military elites, religious authorities, eunuch advisors, and aristocratic families. At times, these tensions spilled over into outright sabotage. The case of Basil the clerk. In 1032, a relatively minor official named Basil, working in the Logothetian II Genicu, uncovered a discrepancy in land tax registers from the theme of Thracian. Rather than report it immediately, he compiled years of tax records, cross-referenced them against military payrolls, discovered that a rival ministry had been double-billing troop stipends and skimming the excess. Basil used this information to blackmail his superior and eventually secured a promotion to protonotarios. It worked for a time. A decade later, another clerk leaked Basil's own falsified records. He was tried, defrocked, and exiled to a monastery. The case became legendary, not for the crime, but for the competence Basil displayed in managing paperwork. Ceremony as control. To ensure loyalty, the empire tied ceremony to bureaucracy. New appointees underwent ritual investitures, receiving robes and insignia in public. Documents were sealed with iconography, often bearing the image of Christ or the Virgin Mary, implying divine witness. The imperial crucible, gold-sealed decree, was reserved for only the most sacred or unalterable orders, making it a coveted prize. Even routine office life was ceremonial. The opening of archives involved liturgical prayers. Document copying began with blessings to avoid errors. Important tax meetings began with the burning of incense. It was a bureaucracy that felt holy, as though each report carried the fate of the empire. Monasteries and the bureaucratic parallel. By the 11th century, many monasteries operated their own bureaucracies, mirroring the imperial state. They kept land registers, tenant lists, income ledgers. They issued contracts, leases, and manumissions, documents freeing serfs. They communicated with provincial officials using court-style language and ceremonial flourishes. In this way, bureaucracy permeated even religious life. Some monks even trained as scribes, entering monasteries to escape the dangers of secular office while still enjoying the prestige of administrative work. The myth of efficiency. Despite its complexity, the Byzantine bureaucracy was not chaotic. It was predictable, flexible in crisis, capable of recording events, resources, and grievances with surprising fidelity. However, it was rarely efficient. Processes often required multiple signatures, redundant reviews, and official countersigns to prevent forgery. A single document might include a request, an annotation from a mid-level official, a review comment, a seal confirmation, a duplication entry, a notation from the archive office. This multi-step process often protected the empire, but it also slowed it down, making rapid reform difficult. The path to decay. By the 13th century, as Byzantine territory shrank and civil wars fractured the empire, the bureaucracy began to hollow out. Offices still existed, but real power shifted to regional magnates and military leaders. Some posts became entirely ceremonial, awarded to appease aristocrats. Archives were destroyed or lost during Latin occupation, 1204-1261. Provinces stopped reporting or began issuing forged correspondence to justify inaction or corruption. Still, even in decline, the ministries held on. An empire could lose territory, but its capital still produced stamped documents. A peasant could still petition for tax relief. A scribe could still hope for promotion. The empire bled at the edges, but the paper still moved. And so we ask, can a state be built from ink and ritual, not swords and speeches? And when power fades, is the last echo a trumpet blast, or a bureaucrat filing a final report? As the sun began to set on the Byzantine Empire and the once mighty imperial boundaries shrank to a fraction of their former reach, one thing remained strikingly consistent: the bureaucracy. Even as the army disintegrated, provincial governors defected, and emperors fell with increasing frequency, the clerks still showed up to work. Documents still bore seals. Tax complaints were still processed. And imperial edicts, signed in golden ink, were still issued as if the empire stretched from the Danube to the Nile. In this final section of our story, we'll follow the Byzantine administrative state into its last century and beyond. We will explore how it persisted through crisis, how it became both relic and reality, and how its legacy continues to echo in modern systems of governance, sometimes in surprisingly familiar ways. For even as Constantinople fell, the paperwork never truly stopped. Empire in collapse, records in order. By the early 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. The Anatolian heartland had been lost to Turkish emirates. The Balkan territories were fracturing under local warlords. Civil wars tore apart what remained of centralized control. Constantinople itself once a metropolis of over 500,000, was a depopulated city of around 30,000. And yet, the offices inside the great palace complex and other administrative buildings kept functioning. Some had moved to smaller quarters, others now operated out of monastic scriptoriums or borrowed space in noble homes. The surviving ministries were drastically understaffed, but they still followed the forms and formulas laid down centuries earlier. One 14th century order to a provincial bishop regarding sheep grazing rights included 6 layers of stamps and review notations, despite the fact that the province in question had fallen under foreign control years before. The paper fortress. In a sense, Byzantium became a bureaucratic fortress, a state whose physical reach had collapsed, but whose documents still projected authority. Farmers continued to request exemptions from military levies. Local bishops still registered land gifts to the church using imperial forms. Merchants sailing into Constantinople were handed customs forms printed in outdated dialects. Even foreign rulers, Serbs, Bulgars, Venetians respected the appearance of Byzantine administrative formality, often mimicking its structures. This was a kingdom of paper, but it was still a kingdom. The rise of the pen aristocracy. As the military aristocracy fell into disrepute during repeated defeats, a new class rose to prominence. The administrative intelligentsia, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as the pen aristocracy. These were men, and occasionally women, who held clerical and fiscal offices, maintained court access, acted as diplomats, advisors, and record keepers, often had formal education in classical Greek, law, and theology. Prominent figures like Theodore Metachites and Nikephoros Gregoras were not generals or aristocrats, they were bureaucrats and scholars, praised for their elegance in writing and administrative skill. Their robes were no less splendid, their pensions no less envied. The bureaucratic response to crisis. When crises struck, and they did often, the Byzantine bureaucracy didn't always respond with military force. It responded with edicts of tax amnesty, diplomatic letters and trade grants, ecclesiastical realignments, marital negotiations, tracked in official registries. In 1347, during a major outbreak of the Black Death, the imperial administration issued a series of health ordinances regulating burial zones, limiting market activity, and attempting to restrict movement in and out of the capital. While limited in effect, these responses demonstrate an enduring belief in the power of policy over panic. The empire's walls might crumble, but the ledgers remained tidy. Palaiologan paperwork. The Palaiologos dynasty, 1261–1453, oversaw Byzantium's final phase. Their rule was often cash-starved, politically fragile, culturally rich, and administratively self-aware. They continued producing imperial decrees, tax reforms, liturgical mandates, and urban planning documents, even as the state's geographic footprint shrank to almost nothing. One of the last major tax codes, issued by Emperor Manuel II, reveals a tragic irony: a tax on agricultural output for regions that had been under Ottoman control for over a decade. The ledgers didn't reflect reality. They reflected memory, the memory of empire, of legitimacy, of bureaucratic continuity. The final documents. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell to Sultan Mehmed II. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died in battle. The empire officially ended. But somewhere in the city that day, it is believed that imperial scribes were still copying out letters, reviewing logs, or preparing ceremonial documents. There is no surviving record of the final document issued by the Byzantine government, but there is little doubt that something was produced that week. An order, a grant, a tax deferment. The office may have been sacked, the scribes killed or enslaved, but the process would have continued until the very end. The Ottoman inheritance. Sultan Mehmed II did not destroy the Byzantine bureaucracy, he absorbed it. Many Greek officials were retained in administrative roles. The Ottoman Divan, imperial council, mirrored Byzantine ceremonial structures. Fiscal records, taxation systems, and land registries continued with Byzantine frameworks. Even the tradition of imperial scribes and sealed documents endured only now in Ottoman Turkish, using Arabic script and Islamic legal theory. The ghost of Byzantium lived on in forms, offices, and stamps. Echoes in modern governance. Today, Byzantine bureaucracy often gets a bad reputation. The very word Byzantine is used to mean convoluted, excessive, or inefficient. But this caricature hides a deeper truth. The Byzantine Empire created one of the most stable administrative traditions in human history. Its methods survive in modern Greek civil service structures, Eastern Orthodox ecclesiastical governance, Ottoman and post-Ottoman state systems, legal terminology still used in property and tax law. The idea that a government can endure through paper, even when its borders collapse, is a deeply Byzantine legacy. The real power was the pen. For a millennium, the Byzantine Empire endured not because it was always strong, or always united, or always devout. It endured because it could document, revise, and transmit its structures across generations. Clerks copied policies that outlived dynasties. Petitions moved between offices while generals fled their posts. Emperors fell, but the chartularios showed up for work the next morning. This was not romantic. It was dull, tedious, bureaucratic, and it kept the empire alive. Final reflection. What if survival is not built on courage, conquest, or charisma, but on the dull resilience of record-keeping? What other empires today, propped up by systems and signatures, might also believe themselves immortal?